And now, ladies and gentlemen, the Desert Inn has the honor to present to you, for the first time in an American cabaret, a man who within his own lifetime has become a legend. Tonight he will sing for you a program of his own songs, old and new.
In the mid-century, one name more than any other seemed to epitomise wit and sophistication. The friend of reigning monarchs and world leaders, top of the A-list, and a star among stars, his extraordinary gifts as a socialite and style icon would probably have been enough to secure him at least some prominence in the abstracts of his time, had he not also been blessed with what he described himself with uncharacteristic modesty as a talent to amuse. He was an actor and a director, a composer and a playwright, one of the first stars on television, a filmmaker, novelist and painter. To his friends, he was known, not entirely ironically, as the Master. The world knew him as Noel Coward.
Don't be afraid, I'll betray you, and destroy all the plans you have made. But even your schemes must leave room for my dream, for when I want to return, I'll still have something of my own, a little pride, mine alone.
After all of which, it comes as something of a surprise to learn that Noel Pierce Coward was born neither into the purple of the aristocracy nor the comfort of inherited wealth. Dad was a travelling salesman remotely connected with business, and Mum, Noel's first and most enduring fan, a suburban housewife with memories of a former grandeur which had faded to oblivion. True, both Arthur and Violet came from families who had known better days. Mum even boasted connections with a baronetcy, and Noel was to spend most of his life in an attempt to restore the family to its former fortunes and what he considered to be an appropriate social status. But for the time being, he had to content himself with a pleasant, pooterish semi in the South London satellite town of Teddington.
Take a pair of sparkling eyes, hidden ever and anon in a merciful eclipse. Do not heed their mild surprise, having passed the Rubicon. Take a pair of rosy lips. Take a figure trimly planned, such as admiration whets. Be particular in this. Take a tender little hand, fringed with dainty fingerets. Press it in parenthesis.
Arthur and Violet Coward had met in the local operatic society. Both were fond of music, and the operettas and musical comedies of the day found the soundtrack to their courtship and marriage, and to young Noel's early days. Noel absorbed the music of Lionel Monckton and Edward German, humming and singing the tunes before he could speak, and he remained to the end of his days a passionate supporter and ambassador for light music, lamenting its eclipse in favour of the more demotic pop that became ubiquitous in his last years. One blind spot was Gilbert and Sullivan, which Coward, who owed so much to both of them, cordially detested to the end of his days. I wonder if it didn't have something to do with the fact that it was Arthur's favourite. Noel never had very much time for Dad.
Keep them if you can, take all these, you lucky man, take and keep them if you can,
Both parents were in their 30s when they married, and while marriage produced 2 other children, it seems that things went quickly awry. Mum and Dad were to stay together until Arthur's death in the 1940s, but they lived always as pensioners of their now world-famous son. Mum was awarded great respect and almost fanatical love, written to every week and sometimes more often, and always accompanying Noel on first nights, although she was always dispatched by taxi when the curtain came down. But Dad became an increasingly shadowy figure, little better than chauffeur and odd job man, with Noel most definitely the alpha male. Perhaps Arthur's inability to provide for his family led to the loss of his position, and once Noel became the chief breadwinner, which happened very early on, Mum's whole attention and all of her energies seemed to have been transferred to her firstborn. It was clear from the outset that there was something remarkable about Noel. Less partisan observers found his precocity disturbing, and he seems to have exhibited signs of hyperactivity and of a mild autism, which, in the age of children being seen and not heard, was hardly regarded as admirable. Medical advice was sought, and his doctors diagnosed a brain that was growing too fast for his body. They recommended a complete isolation from other children and from any kind of stimulus, the darkened room treatment, in fact. Now, how much of this was for Noel's sake and how much an exercise in damage limitation to others is hard to tell. Certainly, he had an untypical attitude towards childhood and play. Sent away on holiday at the age of 6, he wrote to Mum, informing her that some boys came over to tea, I put on a long dress and danced for them. History does not record how his captive audience received these delights or how their parents reacted either, but the fact that it seemed to have been for one night only speaks volumes. Noel never minded singing for his supper. Later in life, often sit at the piano for hours on end. Occasionally, he outstayed his welcome, and at one Hollywood the hostess was instructed by an irate Frank Sinatra to remove him from the piano at once, together with an interesting suggestion for its future storage, should she fail to do so.
I believe in doing what I can, in trying when I must and laughing when I do. Hey-ho, if love were all, I should be lonely. I believe the more you love a man, the more you give your trust, the more you're bound to lose. Although, when shadows fall, I think if only somebody splendid really needed me, someone affectionate and dear, hell would be ended if I knew that he wanted to have me near. But I believe that since my life began, the most I've had is just a talent to amuse. He-ho, if love were
That solitary holiday was probably the result of Arthur and Violet's inability to keep their son fed over the summer of 1905. Family fortunes had fluctuated considerably, and the leafy glades of Teddington had been abandoned for cheaper, less salubrious suburbs closer to the heart of Empire, the noisy, grimy, and somewhat downtrodden areas of Battersea, Clapham, and Pimlico, where the Cowards were to live in a number of rented flats, quite often taking in a paying guest to make ends meet. Noel got used very early to the idea that home was wherever you chose to make it, and that a family did not necessarily consist of blood relations. Throughout his life, he would form a close inner circle of friends and colleagues who would act as his shield and comfort against an occasionally hostile world. Misfits and oddities like himself, their ability to close ranks and repel invaders became almost legendary. Another possible cause for sending him away was the birth of a brother, Eric, to whom fell the unenviable task of being the sibling of one of the most famous men in the world. Eric was to die young, in his 30s, having failed to find any real niche in life. Noel was affectionate towards him and looked after him as best he could, albeit rather at arm's length. But he appears in the Coward scenography as shadowy a figure as Dad, exiting prematurely when the plot no longer appears to require him, the fool as it were, to his brother's leer. We can't say for certain how much Mum regarded him as the spare, but the attention she lavished on Noel suggests that there might not have been much time left for Eric. Noel was quite simply the apple of her eye.
Don't put your daughter on the stage, Mrs. Worthington. Don't put your daughter on the stage. The profession is overcrowded and the struggle's pretty tough. And admitting the fact she's burning to act, that isn't quite enough. She has nice hands to give the wretched girl her due, but don't you think her bust is too developed for her age? I repeat, Mrs. Worthington, sweet Mrs. Worthington, don't put your daughter on the stage.
Mum was determined to let her little genius have his way in everything. Not that she must have had much say in the matter. He was equally set on a life in the theatre. His first visit to a pantomime had not elicited childish wonder and glee so much as a cold, keen and very analytical eye as he sat, noting what happened and working out how to reproduce the effects on his toy stage, a stage on which the traditional characters and scenery of Reddington's and Pollock's juvenile theatre were altered and remodelled to furnish new dramas composed by Master Noel Coward. He was to carry on this work of refashioning the old into the new throughout his life. And any tendency to cast Mum in the role of that pushy stage mother, Mrs. Worthington, is given the lie by the fact that while Mrs. W's daughter was clearly rather duff, Noel definitely had something. Gifted with a phenomenal memory, impeccable diction, and a good soprano voice fuller than the usual boy treble, he was a formidable talent, and he knew it. Together, mother and son set out to do the rounds of auditions for managers and agents. Noel was 12 years old, and he was going on the stage.
Her personality is not in reality exciting enough, inviting enough for this particular sphere. Don't put your daughter on the stage, Mrs. Worthington. Don't put your daughter on the stage. She's a bit of an ugly duckling, you must honestly confess, and the width of her seat would surely defeat her chances of success. It's a loud voice, and though it's not exactly flat, she'll need a little more than that to earn a living wage. On my knees, Mrs. Worthington, please, Mrs. Worthington, don't put your daughter on the stage. Don't put your daughter on the stage, Mrs. Worthington, don't put your daughter on the stage. Though they said at the School of Acting she was lovely as Peer Gynt, I'm afraid on the whole an ingenue role would emphasize her squint. She's a big girl, and though her teeth are fairly good, she's not the type I ever would be eager to engage. No more buts, Mrs. Worthington, nuts, Mrs. Worthington, don't put your daughter on the stage.
Their joint determination might have made them the bane of every stage doorkeeper in the West End, but it soon paid dividends. Children's plays were peculiarly popular in the Edwardian theatre, and the huge success of Peter Pan had resulted in a string of imitations in which young actors gave their all. One of the more superior was organised by the formidable Miss Lila Field. Miss Field was mounting a production of a play called The Goldfish, and Noel auditioned with his set piece, There is a Green Hill Far Away, which he sang with gestures, rending asunder the hearts of Miss Field and her sister. A contract was offered, £1.50 guineas a week, and Mum was relieved and delighted to hear that they would receive this rather than having to pay it. The cast of The Goldfish included a clever young girl dancer from Cork, Ninette de Valois, and a shy, modest boy actor from North London who was called Alfred Wilmore and who was later better known as Micheál MacLiammóir. MacLiammóir recalled much later that even at 12, Noel was different from the rest. Everything was terribly this or terribly that, everyone was darling, and that everything about him, speech, manners, hairstyle even, were sophisticated and grown up and smart. When Alfred asked Noel what he wanted to be when he grew up, the reply came like a shot. Why, an actor, of course. There's nothing as good as the theatre. That is, if you're made for it. I should think you were, you know, same as me. Noel's success led to another children's play, Where the Rainbow Ends, and, in turn, to a more important engagement, this time with an otherwise all-adult cast, in a farce by that master of comedy, Charles Hawtrey. Noel grabbed his opportunity and attached himself to the great farceur, watching his every move and bombarding him with questions and observations. The actor pretended to be despondent in the face of such hero worship, but took a lot of time out to teach Noel the ropes. Noel remained grateful forever and always insisted that it was Hawtrey and not he who really deserved the sobriquet of master. These early appearances gained critical acclaim and even a fan base. Noel wasn't yet 14, and he was already something of a West End star.
Here's a place where you can call right round and have a cosy cup of tea. So if you're fed right up and got your tail right down, then London
Noel took to his new life like a fish to water. He relished the world of stage doors and darkened theatres, of concrete stairs smelling of Jay's fluid and size dust, of rehearsal lights and run-throughs, of grease paint and exhaustion. Later in life, he looked back on these heady days in a poem read here by the actor John Moffat.
I can remember. The months of November and December were filled for me with peculiar joys, so different from those of other boys. For other boys would be counting the days till end of term and holiday times, but I was acting in Christmas plays while they were taken to pantomimes. I didn't envy their Eton suits, their children's dances and Christmas trees. My life had wonderful substitutes for such conventional treats as these. I didn't envy their country larks, their organized games in panelled halls. While they made snowmen in stately parks, I was counting the curtain calls. I can remember. The months of November and December were more significant to me than other months could ever be, for they were the months of high romance, when destiny waited on tiptoe, when every boy actor stood a chance of getting into a Christmas show. Not for me the dubious heaven of being some prefect's protégé. Not for me the second 11. For me, 2 performances a day.
Noel, however, was hardly starstruck. He developed early on a severely critical eye for other people's theatrical transgressions at least, and he was more than able to stand his ground. When the renowned martinet director Basil Dean attempted to bully him in rehearsal, Noel stopped him with a raised hand. "Mr. Dean, if you ever speak to me like that again, I shall go home to my mother." Similarly, if he thought a direction was misguided, he said so, and with a tact and discretion belying his tender years. Not that he was without his childish side. Indeed, one observer recalled that his first sight of that paradigm of sophistication, Noel Coward, was as one of a chorus of angels in Hauptmann's Hanela, throwing up over the scenery before a full house in Liverpool, the result of an over-ambitious peppermint-eating competition that had occupied the juveniles between matinee and evening performance. The inner child was never very far from the surface with Noel, no matter how terrifyingly grand the exterior appeared to be.
Blasé boys are we, exquisitely free
from the dreary and quite absurd moral views of the common herd. We like porphyry bowls, chandeliers and stoves. We're most spirited, carefully fitted souls. Pretty boys, witty boys, too lazy to fight stagnation. Haughty boys, naughty boys, all we do is to pursue sensation. The portals of society are always open wide.
The world on eccentricity condones. A note of quaint variety we're certain to provide.
We dress in very decorative tones. Faded boys, jaded boys, womankind's gifts to a bulldog nation. In order to distinguish us from less enlightened minds, we all wear a green carnation.
Noel soon developed a streak of independence which today would give rise to the intervention of social services. He began to travel alone to auditions and rehearsals, lingering as long as he could afterwards at the coffee stalls and corner houses of Theatreland. The friends he made came from a wide circle, but were predominantly from an adult, male, bohemian world that had been forced underground, quite literally in some cases, by the fallout of Oscar Wilde's arrest and exile. Why Mum turned a blind eye to these friendships remains something of a mystery. It's been suggested that she saw the privileged upper-middle-class milieu these artists and poets moved in as being sufficiently advantageous to her son to outweigh other scruples she might have felt. More likely is that she was innocent of the implications of such associations, or that, like many another mother in similar situations, she realised the utter pointlessness of closing the stable door after the horse had bolted.
Witty boys, you may sneer at our disintegration. Haughty boys, naughty boys, dear, 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 swooning with affectation. Our figures sleek and willowy,
Our lips incarnadine
may worry the majority a bit.
But matrons rich and billowy invite us out to dine.
And revel in our phosphorescent wit. Faded boys, jaded boys, come what may, art is our inspiration. And as we are the reason for the 90s being gay, we all wear a green carnation. Pretty boys, witty boys, yearning for permanent adulation. Haughty boys, naughty boys, every pore bursting with self-inflation.
We feel we're rather Grecian, as our manners indicate. Our sense of moral values isn't strong. For ultimate completion we shall really have to wait until the day of judgment comes on.
Until the day of judgment comes along. Faded boys, jaded boys, each one prays some sort of soul salvation.
But when we rise reluctantly but gracefully from our graves,
we'll all wear the green carnation.
Noel's particular friend was an artist, Philip Stretfield, who was around 30 when they met. At this distance, of course, it's impossible to tell what the real relationship was. Friends have always insisted that absolute propriety was observed and that it was a platonic, if passionate, friendship. As with all other matters connected with his private life, Noel was to maintain a dignified silence about it to the end of his days. Indeed, when it was suggested that he might come out, he declined on the grounds that there were still a few old ladies in Grimsby who cherished romantic notions about him, and it would be a pity to disappoint them so late in the day. Noel and his friends spent the summer of 1914 pottering in rock pools and rowing on the river, only vaguely aware of the catastrophe that lay ahead. When war was declared at the end of the summer, everyone tended to look on it in the light of Peter Pan, as an awfully big adventure that would all be over by Christmas. Noel was still too young to be called up and had absolutely no intentions of enlisting. He had his career to think of, and throughout the war he did everything he could to avoid that fate, including calling in one or two favours from men in high places. The war was a nuisance and active service something to be avoided at all costs. When, finally, he was drafted into the Artists' Rifles, he suffered first a nervous breakdown and then TB, so that nearly all of his active service was spent in military hospitals. He was later deeply ashamed of his conduct and was to work himself into a shadow in the Second World War in order to make up for it. Stretfield had enlisted at the outbreak of hostilities and had died shortly afterwards from tuberculosis contracted in the trenches. Noel was devastated, and it's possible that this early trauma informed his reaction to subsequent relationships, in which, after a period of intense possessiveness and irrational jealousy, he invariably did the moving on or the leaving.
For I believe that since my life began, the most I've had is just a talent to amuse. Hey-ho, if love were all.
Noel's war was largely spent on Noel. Continuing as a jobbing actor, he also began writing and composing, and his songs were attracting interest even if no one was actually putting out to buy them. Hugely influential in this early period was a young actress called Esme Wynne. Wynne had first met Coward in Where the Rainbow Ends, and they'd become firm friends. Together they began to write sketches, one-actors, and even longer plays, some of which were actually performed. No mean achievement for a couple of 17-year-olds, but less surprising when we see that Podge and Stodge, as they called themselves, were immersed in the theatre to an almost alarming extent. Their letters to each other showed the sort of insight into what works and what doesn't that usually takes lesser mortals half a lifetime to acquire. Equally alarming, to outsiders at least, was the closeness of their friendship, the terms of which were scheduled in a contract of Wagnerian severity, with awful penalties to be exacted for any transgressions on either side. The sexlessness of their relationship was typical of the times, and they mixed up the usual gender roles to become respectively boy-girl and girl-boy. Neither seems to have recognised that the other was male or female, and Wynne's fiancée was shocked to find Esme returning from the loo in a bathroom in which Noel was lying soaking in the tub. Podge and Stodge found his outrage hilarious. The friendship with Wynne was a casualty of Noel's success, though her embracing Christian Science did nothing to help things along. She considered Noel to have been altered and corrupted by fame, and wasted no time in telling him so. She even tried to convert him to at least some sense of the error of his ways, but her words fell on deaf ears. Noel had no truck with anything like Christian Science or any other organised religion. A pagan and his pagan relatives are the happiest people, he wrote. They die easily because they have no regrets for the past and don't believe in the future. He condemned what he called the flimsy mysticism of the threadbare Christian legend and scoffed at the double standards that were upheld by so-called decent people. Besides, he always suspected that other agendas lay behind the missionary instinct.
My family has traditions, I've heard them 1,000 times. My relatives were not excessively bright. They love to go off on missions to rather peculiar climes and lead the wretched heathen to the light. A few of them got beaten up in course of these rampages. My great-aunt Maud got eaten up while singing Rock of Ages. These family expeditions admittedly are a bore, but there is just one uncle that I positively adore. Poor Uncle Harry wanted to be a missionary, so he took a ship and sailed away. This visionary, hotly pursued by dear Aunt Mary, found a South Sea isle on which to stay. The natives greeted them kindly and invited them to dine on yams and clams and human hams and vintage coconut wine, the taste of which was filthy, but the after effects divine. Poor Uncle Harry got a bit gay and longed to tarry. This Aunt Mary couldn't quite allow. She lectured him severely on a number of church affairs, but when she'd gone to bed he made a getaway down the stairs, for he longed to find the answer to a few of the maiden's prayers. Uncle Harry's not a missionary now. Poor Uncle Harry, after a chat with dear Aunt Mary, thought the time had come to make a row. He lined up all the older girls in one of the local sheds, and while he was reviling them and tearing himself to shreds, they took their Mother Hubbards off and tied them around their heads. Uncle Harry's not a missionary now. He's awfully happy, but he's certainly not a missionary now. Now, Uncle was just a seeker, a dreamer sincerely blessed of this. There couldn't be a shadow of doubt. The fact that his flesh was weaker than even Aunt Mary guessed took even her some time to figure out. In all those languid latitudes, the atmosphere's exotic. To take up moral attitudes would be too idiotic. Though nobody could be meeker than Uncle had been before, I'll bet today he's giving way at practically every pore. Poor Uncle Harry, having become a missionary, found the natives' morals rather crude. He and Aunt Mary swiftly imposed an arbitrary ban upon them shopping in the nude. Now, they all considered this silly, and they didn't take it well. They burnt his boots and several suits and wrecked the mission hotel. They also burnt his Macintosh, which made a disgusting smell. Poor Uncle Harry, after some words with dear Aunt Mary, called upon the chiefs for a powwow. Now, they didn't brandish knives at him. They really were awfully sweet. They made concerted dives at him and offered him things to eat. But when they threw their wives at him, he had to admit defeat. Uncle Harry's not a missionary now. Poor dear Aunt Mary, though it was revolutionary, thought her time had come to take a bow. Poor Uncle Harry looked at her, in whom he had placed his trust. His very last illusion broke and crumbled away to dust, for she placed a flower behind her ear and frankly exposed her bust. Uncle Harry's not a missionary now. He's left the island, but he's certainly not a missionary now.
The end of the war saw Noel raring to go. He was talented, able across the board, and well connected with an influential set, many of whom weren't quite sure why they knew him, but were left in no doubt that they were fortunate to enjoy his acquaintance. It was the golden age of the house party, and Noel gave value for money, ready to entertain, play games, or simply talk until the cows came home. Sometimes he was invited to houses because someone else had recommended him. There was, anyway, a dearth of available men after the war, and even someone as highly spiced as Noel was better than sending half the women into dinner unaccompanied. On one occasion, he wired ahead to an unknown hostess that he would arrive by a certain train and would be recognised because he was tall and divinely handsome in grey. The hostess in question is rumoured to have found a sudden reason for sending her 14-year-old son away to his granny's. From time to time, Noel would adopt a family, simply assuming that the success of one weekend gave him the right to turn up whenever he wanted to. And on at least one occasion, the husband drew grave exception to Noel's carrying on like the son of the house. Noel was one of the first people to realise the importance of networking, and without ever giving away any details, was able to suggest that he was the equal of the peers and prime ministers he started to meet on these jaunts. The reality was that he was more or less broke. Mum was now running a boarding house in Pimlico, something not mentioned when he was weekending with the great and the good, and Noel was reduced to demonstrating dances in nightclubs in order to keep body and soul together. He was tireless, however, in his determination to get noticed by the people who mattered.
You've pulled me across the brink, you've chained me and bound me. No escape now, where's the grape now? When is the funeral going to be? Whenever I stop to think, see nature all round me, then I see how stupidly monogamous I am. A lion in the circumstances wouldn't give a damn. For if there were no lioness, he'd lie down with a lamb. Why not me? Any little bug can bite, any little bee can buzz, any little snail on any little oak can feel a little frail and have a little joke. Any little frog can jump like any little kangaroo, but I can't do anything at all but just love you. Any little duck can quack, any little worm can crawl, any little mole can frolic in the sun and make a little hole and have a little fun. Any little snake can hiss in any little local zoo, but I can't do anything at all but just love you.
The problem was that while he was talented in so many different areas, he hadn't quite got any one of them sufficiently right yet for anyone to take a risk. His acting was showy, but lacked depth. His dancing was good, but no better than a host of others. His singing, meanwhile, had gone rather a long way down that green hill far away, so much so that he justified his performances by saying that while he couldn't sing, he knew how to, and that was what made him special. When it came to writing, agents and managers could detect a talent, but as yet no distinctive voice, and his songs irritated in the same proportion as they delighted. There was a general opinion that Noel Coward was just too clever by half.
The sun is shining where clouds have been. Maybe it's something to do with spring. I feel no older than 17. Maybe it's something to do with spring. A feeling I can't express, a sort of lilt in the air, a lyrical loveliness seems everywhere there. That cow resembles a rural dean. Maybe it's something to do with spring. The spring is here, dear, oh dear, dear, can't you see the simply agonizing sheen on every angry little tree? You must admit it's rather fun to think that every single thing that nature ever does is overdone. You see exactly what I mean. It all looks far too clean, a badly painted scene. The grass is far too green. Perhaps there's something we have missed. I never could have kissed a sentimentalist. Still, there's something in the atmosphere, a sort of something, dear, that makes me happy here. The sun is shining where clouds have been. Maybe it's something to do with spring. I feel no older than 17. Maybe it's something to do with spring, a feeling I can't express, a sort of lilt in the air, a lyrical loveliness seems everywhere. There, that sheep's expression is quite obscene. Maybe it's something to do with spring.
Still, there were glimmers of hope, and when Noel's comedy I'll Leave It to You was produced in 1920, bouquets were thrown and cheers resounded. The trade paper, The Sketch, recorded that the play was filled with the spirit of youth, and that given that he was hardly 21, the author showed a skill that was uncanny, while no less an authority than Rebecca West went on to record it as the birth of a considerable dramatic talent. His London career looking distinctly more promising, Noel set his sights on New York. It was a gamble, but what the hell. In 1921, he set sail with a new friend, the Earl of Amherst, aboard the Aquitania. Armed with a formidable list of contacts, Noel was determined to take the town by storm, but he was unprepared for the severity with which the land of the free regulated its social register. Geoffrey Amherst was discreetly informed that while he would be welcome anywhere, his actor chum might prove an obstacle. The 400 simply didn't admit show people unless as entertainment, in which case they ate with the servants. Well, Noel was having none of it, and a few days after his arrival, he was spotted taking some of society's lionesses for a sightseeing trip of their own city. Such was the power of his positive thinking. New friends were made fast and furious, and many were to stay part of his New York circle for decades. If, like Oscar Wilde, Noel had nothing to declare but his genius, it was recommendation enough, and he was pretty soon a fixture amongst the more important intellectual and bohemian crowd. Broadway simply thrilled him. He found the pace and energy with which actors spoke a revelation, and his first sight of Times Square at dusk took his breath away. Such heady treats aside, Noel was still broke and finding it impossible to get work in the States. Pretty soon he was sleeping on floors and living on handouts, enjoying the hell of a New York summer when his friends had decamped upstate and he was too poor to follow them. His health collapsed and he spent a wretched 2 months suffering various debilitating illnesses with no one to tend him but the cockroaches who swarmed everywhere in his borrowed apartment. Cutting his losses, Noel returned to England in time for his 22nd birthday, his passage provided by a friend whose husband worked for Cunard. He had played for higher stakes than he'd reckoned with, and he'd failed. Things weren't much better back home, and early 1922 saw him in dire straits, unable even to afford coal for his fire. Too well known to accept little jobs and not well enough known to command big ones, he had no choice but to sit it out. He was convinced that the key to his future lay in writing for his own generation, rather than the fuddy-duddies who controlled the West End as much in the 1920s as they had in King Edward's day. A clever little play, The Better Half, was performed in London and got his reputation kick-started again. The official censor found the play a very bitter little comedy, one-sided, exaggerated satire. but it rang bells with managers and critics.
We're two chaps who find it thrilling to do the killing. We're always willing to give the girls a treat. Just to drink at the Ritz, call it double or quits, or then we pay, the world is at our feet. Top hats, white specs, look divine on us, there's a shade on us, get a lane on us when we come your way. Gad, 11 o'clock, let's pop into the truck. Here we start the business of the day, as we stroll down Piccadilly in the bright morning air. All the girls turn and stare. We are so nonchalant and frightfully debonair as we chat to Rose, Maud or Lily, who should see the way their boyfriends frown. For they know without a doubt that their luck's right out when they see a couple of men about town. As we stroll down Piccadilly, all the girls say, who's here? Put your hands straight, my dear, for it's Marmaduke and Persever, as we doff heads. Each pretty Billy gives a wink at us and then looks down. For they long with all their might for a red hot night when they see a couple of men about town.
He followed up with a new play, The Young Idea, drawing closely on his country house weekends and the unwitting hosts who'd provided him with ammunition. Its protagonists, brother and sister Sholto and Gerda, are podge and stodge like androgynes, puck-like creatures who look at the world with a grinning innocence which is at once charming and subversive. It confirmed Noel's position as a rising star and as someone with a very definite future. The play was inspired by, if not actually based on, Bernard Shaw's comedy You Never Can Tell. Noel was worried that Shaw might accuse him of plagiarism and sent the grand old man a copy. Surprisingly, Shaw replied at length, making comments and criticisms in the margin and remarking that Noel showed every sign of becoming a great playwright, provided he never read another play of Shaw's again. He even suggested a new idea for the second act, which Coward admitted was the play's salvation. Against the advice of the management, Noel insisted on playing the lead. When it finally came into London, the first night was a triumph. First night like a party, announced the London Times, reporting that the shenanigans of hysterical fans and the cries of Noel, Noel, Noel from the crowd outside provided as much drama as the play in the theatre. The first night crowd was young, sexy, and high as a kite. In Noel, they had found their prophet, and he had found his audience.
Far too much of life you've seen, syncopated child. Maybe if you only knew where your path was leading to, you'd become less wild. But I know it's vain trying to explain, while there's this insane music in your brain. Dance, 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 little lady, youth is fleeting to the rhythm beating in your mind. Dance, 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 little lady, so obsessed with second best, no rest you'll ever find. Time and tide and trouble, never, never wait. Let the cauldron bubble, justify your fate. Dance, 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 little lady, dance, 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 little lady. Leave tomorrow behind.
The buzz surrounding The Young Idea was sufficient to stir others into action. Noel's friend Ned Latham called out of the blue, insisting that he be allowed to finance a new revue dedicated solely to Coward's songs and sketches. The producer was to be the great impresario André Charlot, whose name alone would convey the appropriate coronation blessing on Noel. Noel liked it to be thought that it was Charlot's show, but the reality was that all the money came from Latham, a playboy aristocrat of unbelievable generosity who was to die penniless at the age of 30. The revue was titled London Calling, after the new wireless station signal, and it was to be the most up-to-date show in town. Noel was to star with his old chum Gertrude Lawrence, and together they would take London by storm.
Fantasy in olden days in varying and different ways was very much in vogue. Columbine and Pantaloon, a wistful Pierrot 'neath the moon, and Harlequin a rogue. Nowadays Parisians of leisure wake the echo of an old refrain. Each some ragged effigy will treasure for his pleasure, till the shadows of the story live again. Parisian Pierrot, society's hero, the lord of the day, the rue de la paix is under your sway. The world may flatter, but what does that matter? They'll never shatter your gloom profound. Parisian Pierrot, your spirit's at zero, divinely forlorn, with exquisite scorn, from sunset to dawn. The limbo is calling, your star will be falling as soon as the clock goes round.
Gertrude Lawrence was a streetwise East End girl whom Noel had met in 1916. Telling him some mildly dirty stories and offering him an orange, she remained his friend and muse for 30 years. Together, they epitomised the new world in which it was possible for actors and singers, formerly the pariahs of society, not only to mix with the upper classes, but to set the pace for them in dress, manners and behaviour. It was the Jazz Age, and Noel described himself and his contemporaries as Destiny's tots. London Calling was fast, furious, chic and impeccably stylish, and its success assured, it wasn't long before New York was beckoning. Noel was able to make a triumphant return, his newfound star status allowing him to avail himself of all the fleshpots that latter-day Babylon could provide.
When the saxophone gives a wicked man Charleston, hey, hey, rhythm, all and wide. Start dancing to the tune, the band's crooning, for soon the night will be gone. Start swaying like a reed without heeding the speed that hurries you on. Syncopate your nerves till your body curves drooping, stooping, laughter someday dies. And when the lights are starting to gutter, dawn through the shutter shows you're living in a world of lies. Dance, 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 little lady, youth is bleeding to the rhythm beating in your mind. Dance, 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 little lady, so obsessed with second best, no rest you'll ever find. Time and tide and trouble, never, never wait. Let the cold bubble justify your fate. Dance, 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 little lady, dance, 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 little lady. Leave tomorrow behind.
The Jazz Age was a strange era in which feverish, frenzied activity coexisted with a lethargic indolence. Everything was started with wild enthusiasm, only to fizzle out in boredom and indifference. For those who could afford it, the drug-fueled, drink-soaked 24-hour party became the thing, and Noel became its chronicler. For some time he had been hawking a play round London, which, even given his current high status, was proving impossible to get produced. The Vortex was the story of a mother-son relationship in the highest echelons of society. Mother, widowed in the war, though still young and glamorous, has channeled her grief and frustrations into a series of relationships with considerably younger men. Son has found solace for the pointlessness of his existence in drugs and, despite the presence of a token fiancée, rather too close a friendship with another young chap from his regiment. When his drug habit comes out into the open, a scene of horrible mutual recrimination ensues between Florence and Nicky, an all-night row which ends with both of them promising to rescue whatever they can by way of dignity and love and some sort of belief in the future. Eventually, a small suburban theatre club in Hampstead agreed to stage the play, and Noel went into rehearsal with a mixed cast, playing the male lead himself. But it wasn't all plain sailing. The leading actress left to be replaced by someone who is the exact opposite of the giddy, promiscuous Florence, and an 11th hour call from the censor threatened to close them all down completely. Noel left his cast to it and went to the Lord Chamberlain to plead the absolute morality of his play. It wasn't the last time he'd been called upon to do this, but he succeeded, and the play opened in triumph. In a matter of weeks, it had transferred to the West End, opening on Noel's birthday, and his success was ensured. He was 25 and the lord of the day. Everyone, everywhere, wanted a piece of Noel Coward. Noel cultivated a pose of modest and bemused indifference. I became extraordinarily unspoiled by my great success. As a matter of fact, I still am.
Poor little rich girl, you're a bewitched girl, better take care. Laughing at danger, virtuous stranger, better beware. The life you lead sets all your nerves a-jangle. Your love affairs are in a hopeless tangle. Though you're a child, dear, your life's a wild typhoon. In lives of leisure, the craze for pleasure steadily grows. Cocktails and laughter, but what comes after nobody knows. You're weaving love into a mad jazz pattern, ruled by pantaloon. Poor little rich girl, don't drop a stitch too soon. You're only a baby, you're lonely, and maybe someday soon you'll know. The tears you are tasting are years you are wasting. Life's a bitter foe. With fate it's no use competing. Youth is so terribly fleeting. By dancing much faster, you're chancing disaster. Time alone will show.
His follow-up to The Vortex, Hay Fever, had, if anything, exceeded the earlier success. But there swiftly followed a string of plays which showed signs of the public wearying of him as fast as they'd found him. The demand for new work meant that he dug into his back catalogue and turned up plays which weren't quite up to the mark. He made the mistake of assuming that his name would carry them, and got a rude awakening when one of them, a lust-in-the-dust saga named Sirocco, was quite literally booed from the stage. Almost torn to pieces as he left the theatre, a shocked Noel realised that he couldn't rest on his laurels, and that having worked himself into the ground to get his success, he was going to have to dig even deeper to maintain it. It was a review that once again put him back on top. The great impresario C.B. Cochrane commissioned a new show from him, Words, Music and Book, which was to be called This Year of Grace. The show contained a string of hits, all of which became more or less standards. Noel realised that there was a change in the air. The wild party of the post-war years had produced too many casualties, and a seriousness was starting to come back into lives that were increasingly troubled by the future. Noel cast a critical eye over the poor little rich girls and their too fast lifestyles, wondering where it would lead. He also sensed that Destiny's tots were worn out from the chase and were looking for something else from life other than cocktails and laughter.
A room with a view and you, and no one to worry us, no one to hurry us through this dream we found. We'll gaze at the sky and try to guess what it's all about, then we will figure out why the world is round. We'll be as happy and contented as birds upon a tree, high above the mountains and sea. We'll build and we'll and sorrow will never come, or will it ever come true?
and no one to give advice. That sounds a paradise. Who could fail to choose? With fingers entwined, we'll find relief from the preachers who always beseech us to mind. But we thank you. We'll watch the whole world pass before us while we are sitting still, leaning on our own windowsill. We'll bill and we'll coo, and maybe a stork will bring this, that, and t'other thing to a room with a view.
Noel had ridden the 20s, his 20s, on a wave of success. Some troughs, admittedly, but some astonishing peaks too. His skill had been to capture the zeitgeist without ever really getting overwhelmed by it. True, he was at all those parties and clubs in New York and London, in Paris and Berlin, all divinely decadent, and to all intents and purposes, he was their epicentre and their life and soul. But another, altogether more disciplined Coward was there too, one who noted, recorded, and recycled what he saw in plays, songs, and sketches. He knew the party was over and that something else was needed. But it would have taken a soothsayer to predict the move he would make next, as Destiny's Tot became the undisputed master of the English-speaking stage.